Stanford University.
Good afternoon. It's great to be back on Stanford campus. So I'm Chief Technology Officer for Locus Energy, a monitoring and analytics firm in the distributed renewable energy space. So I'm going to talk today about what's going on in the distributed solar space, what are some of the challenges, and what are some of the things that we at Locus Energy are doing to address some of those challenges. Now, before I get started, I was asked to say a few words about how I got into the role that I'm in today. So for those of you that are students out there and thinking about what you'd like to do after graduation, I think my advice would really boil down to two things, and that's that as you're considering different opportunities, you should really always consider two things. The first, really think about how passionate are you about the mission of the company that you might go work for and the work that you could do there. And then second, think about what is it that you would learn from that experience. And I think if you're really optimized for those two things, you can't go wrong because you'll continue to develop experiences that you're really excited about, and you'll find new and interesting ways to combine those experiences as you continue to move forward in your career. So, I think everybody's advice is always colored by their own experience. So let me tell you a little bit about my experience going from an engineering PhD student here 9 years ago to where I am today. And so as I was an engineering graduate student, I was thinking about what did I want to go do when I wrapped up. And I realized I wanted to go into industry and that I was excited about energy and renewable energy in particular. But I wasn't quite sure what area I wanted to go into. And after being very focused for a number of years on my PhD, I thought it would be interesting to go out and sort of get a broad diversity of experiences. So I took a job with McKinsey & Company, a management consulting firm, and for the next several years worked on a broad diversity of projects, very different from what I had done here at Stanford. I worked on things like growth strategy or commercial strategy or operations transformation type projects. And I worked with clients that were in the energy industry and some in the renewable and solar industries and some in other spaces altogether. And through those experiences, I really learned a lot. And I had a great experience. But after a number of years, I decided I wanted to kind of settle down and travel a little bit less. So I went to a hedge fund in Connecticut that was this global macro quantitative hedge fund, where I had the opportunity to work again on something very different than what I had done both at Stanford and at McKinsey. And there I worked on investment problems around portfolio optimization and risk management. It ended up being a very interesting and exciting experience because I joined just before the start of the financial crisis. So my first year in particular was rather exciting. But throughout the couple of years, I really learned a lot about finance and trading and risk management and what a large-scale analytics platform can really look like. So it was a great experience and I learned a lot. But around that time, I had also been advising the small startup called Locus Energy. And I had been working with them in terms of helping them think through some issues related to the overall business strategy and some of the initial product prototypes. And so as we launched that product prototype and it started to take off, there was this opportunity for somebody to come in and really help grow our technology team and take that initial prototype of an idea and turn it into a world-class monitoring and analytics platform. So I saw that as a great opportunity to really work on something I was really excited about and tie together some of these different elements of my background. So the engineering and databases expertise from Stanford, some of the strategy and electric power and solar expertise I gained from McKinsey, and then some of the risk management and understanding of what a large-scale analytics platform can look like from the hedge fund. And really wrap up all those experiences and apply them to a problem I was very passionate about, and that's helping foster the growth of renewable energy. So I've been with Locus now for 2.5 years, and we've continued to grow and do well. And I have to say that while my path from engineering graduate student to what I've done to what I'm doing today certainly was not a direct one, I think that those experiences that I've had along the way have really helped me prepare well for the type of work that I need to do today. And that's why I'd say, long as you're following things that both you're really interested in and passionate about, and things where you can learn a lot, you really can't go wrong. You'll just find new ways to put those experiences together. So with that, why don't I jump into the rest of the presentation here? So when I talk about distributed renewable energy, particularly distributed solar energy, what are we talking about? So the way we usually think about it is sort of three different segments. There's utility scale, commercial scale, and then residential. And so for utility scale, what we think about are things that are, say, 10 megawatt and above, so fairly large plants, small perhaps by utility standards, but still very large for solar. And these are large point sources of energy generation that are then feeding energy into the grid. For a commercial, we're talking about more things in sort of the 100 kilowatt to 2 megawatt range. And those systems are, say, on, say, large warehouses or rooftops or other types of installations. And they're also oftentimes net producers feeding energy into the grid. And then within residential, talking about much smaller, say, 2 to 10 kilowatt systems. And so when I talk about distributed renewable energy or distributed solar, I'm really talking about the segments 2 and 3 here. And the defining factor is that you're talking about a large number of smaller systems, right, that are producing energy rather than a smaller number of large systems. And the way, each one of these segments operates is a little bit different. So I'll just give a quick example on residential that I'll talk more about later. And that's that within the residential segment, these smaller systems are not net generators exporting back into the grid. They generally operate on what's called net metering. So say if your home, typically consumes 100 kilowatt hours each month, then you would size that PV system to offset a large portion of your consumption, but not all of it. So effectively, the value of the energy that comes out of your solar system is the price that you would have otherwise paid to the utility to supply that energy. So now, in terms of what's going on with distributed solar, this is a chart from a recent McKinsey study talking about expectations for growth in solar. And what some of the key takeaways here are just that solar is really growing quickly, or expected to grow quickly, over the next 8 years, particularly the residential and commercial segments. And so that growth is driven by several different factors, but a few of the more substantial ones are that the cost of solar power is continuing to fall. So you may have seen in the news, there's been a lot of news about some of the challenges solar panel manufacturers have had. Because of these falling prices, it's a tough environment for many of the equipment manufacturers. But for the solar industry as a whole, this is actually a good thing, because what we're seeing is a continuing decline in terms of the cost of solar power, which is good for improving the economic viability of the technology. And then second, utility rates, while they vary, are generally sort of flat to increasing with fuel prices. So as solar prices come down and utility rates are sort of flat to up, those lines start to cross in terms of being economic to install solar in a number of different areas. And then finally, there's a lot of new innovation going on in terms of businesses that help reduce sort of the frictional cost of switching over to solar. So there's things such as the sort of solar finance and solar leasing models that, it used to be much harder to say get someone to come out and install solar panels on your roof, where now it's pretty easy to just over the internet get quotes to have people come and install those systems on your home. So with that reduced sort of frictional switching cost, that's another, I think, interesting driver of the overall industry growth. In terms of some of the benefits of distributed solar, I think there's four main benefits that I think a lot about. And the first one is that when you install solar production systems in a distributed fashion, you can help alleviate some of the transmission distribution bottlenecks because you're really delivering the energy at the point of use, right? So in this diagram over here, in a typical design, you have a large generation plant, which is then sending power over a transmission distribution system down to the residential or commercial buildings you see on the far side there. And so if you can install solar panels out in the field, you can bypass a lot of the congested parts of that transmission distribution network. Second, when you install solar on those rooftops in a distributed way, you get very efficient use of land, because if you're going to go build a large conventional power plant or even a large sort of utility scale power plant, you're going to need to take up a fair amount of land. There's going to be a fair amount of water use and things of that nature. where if you're installing rooftop solar on homes or businesses, that's actually a very efficient use of space because those rooftops are probably not otherwise very productive. Third, installing solar in this way allows you to avoid many of the costs that you need to incur when you use the traditional sort of distribution network there. And that's that, the way the pricing works is that there's sort of a wholesale price from where the energy is coming directly onto the grid, and then there's sort of a commercial price level and a residential price level. And those buckets of costs that you see in between are for the transmission, distribution, load shaping, and all these sorts of things. So if you're going to produce power in a concentrated form of, say, a utility scale plant, you're competing at that wholesale price. Whereas if you are putting these solar panels on somebody's home, you're really offsetting power at that residential price. And so the size of those bars varies, but it's not uncommon for really the cost differential between those two really to say that almost half of the cost at the residential level is for all that transmission distribution costs. And then fourth, this is specific to sort of concentrated versus distributed solar, but a broad dispersion of systems reduces the weather-related volatility effects. So on the left, you can see sort of volatile output from an individual plant. And because of how the grid works, where there effectively isn't storage, so every time a solar power plant ramps up or down, a conventional power plant needs to offset that ramping up or down. And so if you can instead spread a large number of systems over a larger area, you get this nice benefit of the production sort of, it sort of evens out in aggregate, right? You have a nice diversification benefit. So now, that's not to say that installing solar in this distributed way isn't without challenges. So three of the main challenges that we see is that when you have, when production scheduling becomes very different when you have this large distributed network of smaller commercial and residential systems. So utilities are used to operating a smaller number of large point sources of energy that they can turn on and off and ramp up and down. So if you have instead a production map that looks like something on the right there, it becomes much more challenging because you don't have as much control over how much energy those systems are going to produce, and in addition to not having control over them necessarily, you also have trouble figuring out how much they're going to produce, the next day or even in the next hour. So that imposes some interesting challenges around how you're going to manage that grid management problem. Second, there are some issues around maintenance and asset management. So if you have these large generation assets that utilities typically use, you'll have crews that are there to maintain and manage them. Whereas if your generation fleet looks more like what we have on the right there, you have to, it's a different type of problem to solve. You now have to think about problems like, how certain are we about what is wrong with a certain system that's out there in the field, such that we want to send a crew out there to go work on it, right? Or there's also this problem of, it's not usually possible for humans to review the production of every individual system because there are too many. So you need to think about building smarter systems that can automatically identify systems that aren't working properly. And then third, I just said that sort of broadly distributed systems have less volatility. That's not to say that solar doesn't still have volatility issues. So the drivers of volatility, of course, are because you don't control how much sunlight is coming down. And so while there's a diversification benefit of spreading many systems out, because as the clouds come overhead and the power goes down and then back up, you get a nice sort of diversification benefit. Even across, depending on what time scale or area you're looking at, you're still going to have some volatility because as weather patterns roll in and out, you'll still affect, areas. So here, for example, is an example of across 100 systems in San Jose, you'll see that the volatility was much less than for any individual plant, but there still is some volatility that needs to be managed. So in terms of where startups are innovating, there's a whole lot of innovation going on across various areas in the sort of the distributed solar space. And so I'm not going to talk much about the hardware innovations, but there's a lot going on in terms of new generation technologies or new microinverter or DC optimizer type technologies to optimize individual panels and new storage systems and so on. There's this other area of innovation, though, around like software and business model innovation, where I think there's interesting work. And that's, the four I've listed here of solar lead generation. There's some interesting work going on to help connect people for whom solar would be a useful economic sort of investment up with the opportunities to make that investment. So finding people like homes or businesses for which solar would actually be a valuable thing to add. Second, there's a lot of interesting work going on in terms of solar design tools. So nowadays you can get a quote on having solar installed on your home without having someone actually come out and visit your home and survey the roof, because people are using tools like satellite imagery of rooftops to do rough designs without ever going on site. Third, there are a lot of innovations around solar financing, where people have changed the sort of what a number of years ago was, a investment structure whereby you had to, lay out several tens of thousands of dollars to install solar panels on your roof and effectively prepay for, say, 20 years of electricity, to now it's something where, someone else can take the risk of the investment, and they'll come and install panels on your roof, and you just pay them monthly for the energy that's generated from those systems. And then fourth, there's work going on around data and analytics that sort of cuts across some of these different areas to help people really optimize how their fleet is operating and figure out, how can they make things run better. And that's the area that we at Locus Energy are focused on, and what I'll talk more about from here on out. So we provide monitoring and analytics for distributed solar systems, and we see that as sort of three main areas that we provide service in. The first is because we install sort of high precision power meters and then come up with ways to get that data back to our platform. People use us as effectively their cash register around figuring out how much should they be billing their clients for. If you're a solar finance client, solar finance company, and you want to go out and install thousands of rooftop systems, you need some way to get data back on how much energy all your systems are producing so that you can bill your clients appropriately and figure out how you're doing with respect to your performance contracts. So we sort of provide that whole data and analytic backend to make that happen. Second, we work on diagnostics and tools for operations management. So for example, if you have those thousands of systems that you've deployed, and now people are paying you for the generation that comes out of them, and you're the asset owner, you have a strong interest in making sure that all those systems perform well. So you'll want something that lets you know in an automated way if any of those systems start to underperform, or if any of those systems appear to have any sort of problems of certain components breaking. So we provide those sorts of diagnostics and alerts for our clients. And then third, we're working on additional analytics that can help both reduce the cost of managing these systems and help people manage them better. So we're working on some advanced analytic technologies like the ability to estimate how much sunlight is hitting any square kilometer in North America, so you can better assess how is the performance of your system working. So we monitor a fairly broad base of systems, both globally as with some strong concentrations in sort of California and in the Northeast. So we have well over 10,000 sites that we're monitoring, and most of those sites are then sending us data every 5 minutes, so we get sort of a fairly good real-time picture as to what's going on in the field. And then from those sites, we get a number of different types of data. As you might expect, among that reported data, we get things like energy, power, voltage, frequency. And then we also can talk to a lot of the solar generation equipment on site, so we can get things like inverter fault codes. So if the inverter, which is converting the DC power out of the panels into AC power in the grid, if it overheats or has some other problem, we can notify our clients that that has happened. And then third, for clients that have additional weather sensing devices on site, we gather all that sort of data in terms of sunlight energy or temperature or wind. And then we pull down some other helpful additional data, so things like satellite imagery or additional weather station data. And so all that data from these different types of sites is then piped over a cellular and a wired internet connection, depending on the installation. And then in addition to getting all of this data back in real time, then we also then try and collect information about the sites that we're monitoring. Because as you might imagine, the more we understand about the systems that we're monitoring, the better job we can do of assessing are they performing as they should. And so we gather information about the installed hardware, so what are the different models and the different pieces of equipment. We gather information about how those systems are configured in terms of orientation, tilt, etc. And then we gather information about where they're located. And then we can use all of that data to really help people get a better picture of what is their fleet of PV systems doing. So when we talk about using software to help reduce the cost of solar, there are three main areas that we're trying to focus on in terms of developing some new interesting technologies. And so one is to reduce the need for many expensive on-site hardware if we can provide equivalent information just by using better software and analytics. So an example there is we've built out a system that provides a radiance estimation anywhere across North America on a sort of square kilometer basis. And I'll talk more about this later, but this helps some of our clients alleviate the need to install physical irradiance sensors on site at all of their installations. And then it can also help clients who wouldn't otherwise have installed those anyway, just get this type of information, which is a prereq for most types of fleet analyses. Second, we're trying to support the solar finance industry with some additional performance analysis tools. And so here we've done some thinking around a couple of different areas I'll talk about. One is just data cleansing and validation, because anytime you're gathering data on thousands or tens of thousands of sites in terms of manually entered data about what sort of equipment is being used or how is it configured, there's going to be some data entry issues, and we've come up with some ways to try and validate and take care of those issues. Second, we're taking a look at some weather risk data analysis to help people understand what sort of risks are they taking on when they're using these sort of standard weather data files to estimate how much energy their system is going to produce. And then third, we're working on some fleet level analysis tools to help people figure out across all of their tens of thousands of systems what's really driving that fleet's performance in terms of what are any outlier conditions that are causing them to either overprice or underprice the investments they're making. And then third, I'll talk about some of our work to help support the broader distribution of solar by addressing some of these grid integration issues. So I mentioned up front some of the challenges with a sort of a high penetration of distributed solar is that there are these issues of forecasting how much energy can we rely on these systems to produce tomorrow, or what is the near-term volatility going to look like, what's going to happen with all the solar production in the next hour or next 2 hours. So we're working on some tools around solar energy forecasting to help grid operators or utilities better understand what's going to happen with all the solar energy that's being produced, such that they can effectively manage a larger installed base of solar without sort of capping it or adding additional cost into the system. So first on this, on the irradiance estimation issue, if you think about it, sunlight is the fuel for all solar power systems. So if you're measuring the energy that's coming out of the system, unless you're measuring the sunlight energy that's coming in, you can't really get a good picture of how well and how efficiently that power plant is operating. And so there are two ways to get that data. One way is to use a physical on-site sensor, and these are things like reference cells or pyronometers. And some of the features of these are that they can provide accurate, high granularity data. So if you want 5-minute data, or even less if you want 1 minute or 30-second data, these devices do a fantastic job. Some of the trade-offs, though, is that they're also somewhat expensive. And then they also require maintenance, because as these sensors accumulate dust or other types of debris, they become less accurate, right? They're going to underestimate the amount of sunlight in place. So there's an alternative approach, and we've released a technology that does this, which is sunlight modeling. And here, what we're looking at is how much sunlight is reaching the Earth or reaching that solar power system as fuel. And if you think about it, the amount of sunlight energy that's reaching it is a function of where is the sun in the sky. And so that's a fairly long-solved problem. And then there's the element of what's the condition of the atmosphere, because that controls how much sunlight is getting through. And so that's a problem that also can be solved if you pull in things like satellite imagery and ground weather data. You can get a pretty good view into what's the condition of the atmosphere and how much sunlight is getting through and reaching those solar panels. So the features here is that these types of systems are accurate for sort of hourly or greater time periods. So if what you're interested in is really knowing is over the course of the last couple hours or day or month, how is my solar system performing, this type of technology can work great. Second, it's inexpensive and scalable, because once you build this type of system, you can apply it across the entire country, right? So we currently offer this all across North America in sort of roughly 1 square kilometer grids. So at scale, if you have tens of thousands of sites, it's much cheaper to use something like this than it is to go and install physical sensors everywhere. And then third, there's no need for on-site maintenance, because these are data-driven models that aren't going to be subject to any sort of need for maintenance on site. And so this is an example of building, an interesting sort of software and data analytic technology that can help clients in the distributed solar space operate, both better and more cost effectively. So next, I'm going to go into some of the technologies that we're working on to support folks in the solar finance space. And so first is this issue of data validation. And if you have any bad data in terms of location or equipment configuration, that will, of course, skew any sort of fleet-level analysis. So we wanted to think about how can we validate some of the data that we're receiving from people that has been manually entered. And so there are two aspects to that. One is doing location validation, and another is configuration validation. And now on location validation, we've come up with a number of different techniques, but the two I'll cover here briefly are this approach of using solar noon to figure out where it is, because you can tell from that just simply the time-stamped production curve where does sort of the peak generation occur. And so if you make some adjustments, you can actually kind of figure out where is the sun at the peak in the sky, and therefore, where is the system located on an east-west basis to within roughly 15 or 20 miles. The second thing that you can do is if you have a good density of systems, you can do things like correlation-based analyses to take the production of a system whose location you're not quite as certain of or that you'd like to check and compare it to other systems that are in the area, right? And you can check basically the correlation of this uncertain system versus the other production curves and figure out, what sort of production is it most correlated with. So using things like that, we can help validate location. And then on the configuration side, we can use some similar type techniques. So on the top, to get a good feel for sort of the east-west orientation, we can take a look at the skew of the production curve. And then using that irradiance estimation engine that I was just talking about on the previous slide, since we know the sunlight energy that's coming in, we can do a search using a PV model through the possible orientations and configurations to figure out what sort of orientation configuration best matches the energy that's coming out with the energy we see coming in. So then another thing we've taken a look at is trying to understand how representative are the typical weather files that people use when we're putting together some sort of performance contract. How representative are those of what actually happens in the future? So people use these things that are called like typical weather files or TMY files to figure out for any given location what's the typical amount of sunlight that comes in, hour by hour over the course of a year. And they'll use those to put together the financing contracts for new installations. But the question comes up is how much can you rely on those typical weather files to actually represent what's going to happen in the future? Because there can be a lot of volatility, of course, in terms of what actually happens. And so we took a look at sort of the latest set of weather files that were generated. And then we also took a look at all the irradiance data for, I think it was the following 6 or 7 years after that, and took a look at how well do those typical weather files usually represent what you actually get out of the systems. And so what we found was that they do a good job. And the red line that you see in the middle there is sort of on a median basis, what we found is that the actual sunlight was slightly more than what the weather files would have suggested, which means that these files are somewhat conservative as people are using them to bid out projects. Additionally, we found that there can actually be some fairly wide swings, as you see in the purple and the blue lines there, in terms of what sort of a high or low month can be. And so even on a monthly or quarterly or even annual basis, there can be a decent amount of fluctuation or volatility between what the weather file would suggest you should expect and what you'll actually get. And so the reason this is important is that right now, as people are putting together financing deals on projects, they'll use data like this to try and figure out how should they price that contract. And so if they have less confidence, they need to, or if they perceive higher risk, they need to be more conservative and sort of haircut those numbers further, which then means that the cost of solar production or the cost of that finance system will be higher, right? So the more transparency we can provide people in terms of helping them understand what is truly the risk associated with making these types of investments, our hope is the more efficient people can then price these systems, and therefore, the faster we can bring down the cost of distributed solar energy. A third thing that we're working towards in terms of helping these clients is helping them really understand, once they have a large fleet of systems that are deployed, what are really the drivers of performance on those systems. So say if you start with a certain design capacity that you had built, right, and now you're observing a certain performance in the field, many people then, they see the design and they see the observed, and then the question is, okay, why? So if I'm slightly outperforming my expectations for the year, is it because I got really lucky on the weather, or is it because the systems you got unlucky on the weather and the systems are doing much better than you expected? So helping people disaggregate these different performance factors into what is weather driven versus what are actual real impacts in terms of, are you being too aggressive or conservative on your design? So when you actually build the systems in the field, are they producing the energy you thought they would, right, is the first bucket? Or are you having uptime or equipment issues in terms of things not producing as well as you would expect, or things, inverters are failing more quickly? And then third, are you having degradation issues where you're seeing that system degrade at a faster or slower rate than you expected? So all of these factors can go sort of positive or negative versus what people's expectations are. But when people don't have this type of insight into what's going on with their fleet, they have to be more conservative, right? And by being more conservative, they're increasing the prices for systems to offset that risk. And so our goal is to provide them better transparency into how do those systems actually perform, and then what are some of the drivers of the performance, right? So are there certain locations or equipment types or things that are causing the production to come out the way it is, right? So helping people really, when you have all these tens of thousands of systems, distill down to actionable things that clients can do to reduce their costs or get more accurate in terms of how they quote projects. So now I'm going to move on to the third piece, which was some work we're doing around trying to help grid operators or utilities better understand how much energy solar systems are going to produce, both in near term or longer term. And this, remember, is important because right now there can be caps on the amount of solar that's allowed to go into any particular regions, because utilities or grid operators aren't confident in terms of understanding how those systems are going to perform. So the more insight we can provide around, and more confidence we can inspire around, that these systems can be reliable and you can understand how much energy they're going to produce, the more we can do to help foster the growth of distributed solar energy. So when people look at forecasting solar, there are really 3 time horizons that they'll take a look at. So the first is sort of a 0 to 6 hour time frame, where people are looking at really just tracking clouds through the sky. So, because keep in mind, if the sun is where it is, and therefore it's the clouds or other things in the atmosphere that are affecting how that light is coming through. So if you can track cloud movements, you can predict what's going to happen with solar production. On a sort of a little bit further out, in sort of a 6 hour to 10 day range, what people look at are numerical weather forecasting. Because here it's more about, you can't predict where the cloud is going to be precisely, 3 days out, but it's really more about, is it going to be, partly cloudy or rainy, or what's generally the cloud condition going to look like? And therefore, you can get some sort of expectation around how much energy the solar power systems will produce. And then third, going out a little bit further, sort of 10 days and beyond, you're thinking about what are sort of typical expectations for weather in that area, because right now today, my best estimate for what the weather is going to be like on September 1st is basically what the weather has historically been on September 1st for some location. So across those three horizons, we think that we can add some interesting insights, particularly on this first sort of 0 to 6 hour time frame, because of the nature of our business where we're collecting real-time data. So keep in mind, most of the systems that we monitor are sending us this data every 5 minutes. So we get a sort of steady stream of data as to what's happening in the field. So we think we can have a real impact here in the short time frame. And now, in terms of how people do these short-term forecasts, it's really about, as I said, looking at how the clouds are moving. So if you start with some images, whether ground-based or satellite-based, of what the sky looks like, and you distill out of those images where are the clouds, and then you take, say, your most current set of those images, and you look at sort of some of the images that preceded it, you can figure out what do the cloud motion vectors look like. So where are those clouds going? And so if you can figure out where all the clouds are going, you can then apply those motion vectors to your most recent image of where the clouds are, and therefore you can forecast where they're going to be. And so with that, you can really forecast on whether it's a 1 minute or 10 minute or hour or several hour out time frame. You can have a view on where the clouds are going to be, and therefore what the solar production is going to look like from any sort of distinct areas. And so even with just satellite imagery alone, you can do this on sort of a square kilometer basis, so you can get reasonably good resolution on how you think that's going to affect solar production. And now if you overlay this on a big distributed solar generation area, you can then get a good feel for overall what's going to happen with that production. So this is roughly how the basic near-term forecasting technologies work. And the area where we think we can add, where we can both do this and then we can add some additional value, is we think that we can add two things to this picture that can add value for people that are interested in these forecasts. And so the first is that by integrating the real-time data with the forecast data, we think we can improve the forecast models by incorporating the actual observed impact of these clouds. So the way most of these satellite or just imagery-driven models work is they try and assess what's sort of the composition of the clouds and therefore how much sunlight is getting through. And so if we can actually observe the impact of the cloud on a particular solar system, right, and then we're forecasting where that cloud is going to go, we can take into account the sort of observed cloud impact as a feedback loop on how it's going to affect the solar production of other systems as it continues on its way. And so then that's sort of shown here in the second picture. So at t = 0, if we make that forecast, then again at t = 0, if we say that cloud is going to now move to the right, we can then estimate with better accuracy how that second PV system is going to be affected, because we observe what it's doing right now. And then second, we think that we can continuously evaluate the accuracy of all these forecasts, which has a lot of value, because now what we can do is at t = 10 minutes, we can say, okay, now the cloud is over there. How well did we do, right? Were we able to actually predict what it was going to do when it got there? And that's important because as we've talked to some utilities about this problem of understanding and forecasting solar production, they've said there can be different forecast technologies out there, but one of their main concerns is if they have to make real-world decisions about how they're going to allocate their assets and how they're going to, what power plants they're going to turn on or off or manage, they want to have a high degree of confidence that that forecast model is actually working well, not just on the design data, but on the data that's happening today. And so using this type of technology, we'll be able to both forecast what's going to happen, and then on a trailing basis of hourly or daily or what have you, be able to tell people exactly how well we're doing with those forecasts. So this is some of the work that we're doing to try and alleviate these issues of large-scale grid integration. And with that, I'll open up the floor for questions.
Got plenty of time for questions, so please don't be shy.
Yes?
Who exactly are you selling to? You're selling to the individual homeowner, to some company that's financed putting these panels on the house, or to the utility, or to all three? And are you going to have any competitors doing the same thing?
So we do have competitors, and we sell to three different segments. So we sell to both, say, solar finance and leasing companies that have some of the problems I described here of needing to actively manage all the assets that they've distributed around in the field and now need to be able to bill their clients based upon and manage and maintain the performance of. Second, we sell to large installers or integrators that are building, say, commercial scale solar plants, because there they have these similar monitoring requirements around trying to understand what the systems are doing and maintaining them and making sure they meet certain performance expectations. And then third, we work with some OEMs who want to embed monitoring in their product, because if, say, for certain inverter makers or other people, right, if they want to include monitoring in the package of things they offer, but they see it as non-core to what they do, they can use us on a white labeled basis to provide sort of a monitoring back end for their product. And those are kind of our three main segments.
Do you charge the individual homeowners for your service, or do you just use their data as the price you charge?
So we do not charge individual homeowners. So we sell to other businesses, so either the companies that are financing and leasing these, right? And so the data that's being collected is the production off of those assets that are then owned by a third party, right? So yeah, we do not, we're usually sort of a back-end white labeled solution, so we don't sell directly to end users. We do, as an additional sort of side service of ours, is we also provide end user interfaces. So our clients that want to have, say, web pages that their clients can log into and go look at the solar production, right, we will provide that as a white labeled service that they can then brand for their own company, or put up, say, so say, there's company X that is installing solar panels on, say, the building here, right? And they want to put up a kiosk in the lobby where people can have sort of touchscreen interactive views of the energy of what is producing and what it's done, right? So we'll provide that, and the branding on that will be for company X rather than us, right? So we see ourselves as an enabling technology to help other businesses with their larger business problems. Yes?
Do you provide any information back as to optimal cleaning schedules for the panel installations?
We do not currently. So that's when I talked about some of that sort of that waterfall chart of performance and trying to understand that, is we're working towards being able to provide that type of analysis. That's exactly the type of service that we might be able to offer, right? To help people understand, if you're seeing advanced degradation and we think it's because of dust accumulation or other problems, then perhaps we could offer that. But that's not a service that we can offer today. Yes?
As a data business, it's interesting that you guys don't have any direct costs, really. How do you guys figure out pricing in this kind of world?
So what we definitely have some direct costs in terms of the equipment that we'll sell to go into sites in the field, right? And then we need to think about our internal infrastructure and operating cost. So in terms of, so I'm on the technology side, not the pricing guy, but I can just say that one of our goals here is really to build a low-cost, large-scale analytic platform, so we try and price pretty competitively. Yes?
If you're retrieving fault codes from the inverters, that means you're probably talking to them on Modbus or something. Can you also control the inverters to cut down the amount of power they're generating sometimes they're over voltage, or can you, if they have large inverters, change the power factor?
Right. So the question was, do we do any commanding of inverters or equipment in the field? And so that is a service that we do provide for some clients in very targeted cases to allow them to command equipment in the field. That is a more monitoring and analytics focused business. That's not something we've gotten a lot of demand from, I'd say, a large segment of our clients from. So it's something that we right now provide on a more targeted basis for specific clients. Yes?
Are the ISOs buying your data?
No, not currently. And I should add that our data is, the data is owned by our clients, right? So we have access to it to perform these types of analyses, to try and use it in aggregate form to help them and help the broader industry. But we don't sell any data to ISOs right now. Yes?
Are you working on demand management? So, like, it might help to integrate solar if people are matching up their consumption with what they're generating?
No, so we do some consumption monitoring for clients in certain areas, but we are not focused on the demand management side. There are a number of, that's a whole other interesting space of a lot of companies that are working on that. And we see ourselves right now as sort of having our hands full in terms of this problem being a pretty big, interesting one. So we haven't explored that much yet. Yes?
In terms of the cloud forecasting, it looks like it's basically a data-based approach. You actually track the clouds and develop the vectors and so forth. Have you thought of combining that with some kind of meteorological model as opposed to more data focused? Or maybe I just didn't understand it.
No, you're right on, and that's among the things that we want to look into. So the first cut is to use the data-driven approach and try and incorporate our real-time data into that. And then, of course, longer term, there's lots of opportunities across, those three different segments I just discussed, right, of the real-time cloud tracking versus numerical weather modeling versus long-term sort of what you would expect. To really, notice those curves kind of overlapped, and that's because at certain points, there's value from more than one approach. And so we have interest in exploring some of those things in the future, yes. Yes?
What's the minimum size in megawatts or whatever that you need in a general area for this type of deployment to make sense financially, and what kind of cost per kilowatt hour would it be tacking on to the cost structure to a project developer?
So your question is, what's sort of the minimum scale of solar installation that's cost effective?
Yeah, like if you're selling it to Solar City, I took one of your comments to mean you're selling it to like a Solar City, so they've got a whole bunch of deployments in a residential area, for example, or you could sell it to a larger, a project developer of larger projects that has, a couple megawatts or more deployed.
Yep.
I could see it penciling out, but I can't see it for a single household to pay for the meteorological or the measuring equipment, communications equipment, and whatnot.
Yeah. So we do monitoring for individual homes, sort of individual isolated homes or buildings, because we've gotten to the scale where we can actually provide that on a very cost-effective basis. Sending the data back over cellular or piggybacking on the internet. In terms of the scale at which it makes sense to have a physical sensor there versus using this data-driven approach, I actually don't have a great answer for that. We find that, so from our perspective as the monitoring analytics provider, we're happy to make use of whatever data the clients can make available to us. And so what we've tried to do here is really push the envelope of what data they can have available by providing this whole other route to getting that sunlight data. But in terms of when does it make most economic sense to use one approach versus the other, it's tough for me to say. Some of our clients, are interested in actually using both, right? Because then they have multiple redundant sources. But I don't have a great answer in terms of what's most economically important there. Yes?
What would you say is the most interesting recent barrier or problem you've been working on? You can answer that in terms of technology or a business model.
So from a technology perspective, I think some of the most interesting stuff we've been working on recently are the last couple of things I went over here. So the ability to create these large-scale, sort of broad-based forecast models, and then the ability to really dig in and understand fleet-level performance now that we have this capability to figure out how much sunlight fuel is coming in anywhere across North America. So I think those two problems are things that I'm really excited about personally because I think they can have a big impact in terms of helping to support the industry.
Yeah. When generation picks up, increases in percentage of demand, there'll be more times when generation exceeds demand, causing problems for the generation systems. Is there a way you can implement pushback?
You mean in terms of throttling of the production from
Right.
assets? Yeah, that can be done. As I say, we do that for some clients today. It's really about being able to command inverters or things in the field to tell them to shut down. So yeah, there's definitely technology out there to do that. And that's something that we provide for some clients. I think that in terms of current levels of solar penetration, that's not a real big concern in most areas, because if you're dealing with these sort of broadly distributed systems, it's rare that you're going to get so much energy out of them that you're going to have that type of problem today. But yeah, at some point in the future, that may become more important. So, yes?
What is the performance of your this current forecasting model, and what portion of it do you think is due to the weather forecasting error, and what portion of it is due to the modeling error of the PV system?
Got it. Okay. So what we currently, in terms of the first cut on that, we've currently assessed it mostly at the level of what's the error in terms of the forecast error rather than the PV system error. The PV system error tends to be more of a known error. So in terms of that forecasting system, it of course degrades over time. So I would say that the technology we built here is currently in R&D stage. So I think some of our more recent numbers are sort of in the range of, it's within like 10 or 20%, looking out a couple hours. But it's something that we're still working on and refining, and something that we'll have better insight into those sorts of numbers as we move forward with it.
How much of the data and model output that you have is available publicly on the website?
The data that we monitor?
Is there any aggregate data that's available?
So there isn't any aggregate data that we currently make available. So this is data that we collect and manage for our clients. So then we make it all available to them, but it's not data that then we make more broadly publicly available. Yes?
So, have you been doing this long enough to see a feedback to the system so that an installer could quote an installation, say on a residence, that you would need, say, 10% more panel areas than he would have proposed, say, 5 years ago, or 10% less, or do you see, have you experienced any feedback like that so far, and which way has it gone, and do you think it's making solar electric more or less effective?
So I haven't personally received that feedback. So I'm on the technology side, so I may not have gotten that feedback. But I mean, I think that our overall goal and mission is to use sort of software and analytics like this to help drive down the cost of solar. So I certainly hope that we're having an impact on that front, but I haven't gotten any sort of specific anecdote of that type of feedback. Yes.
From the technological as well as the business perspective, how do you see Locus fitting into kind of a wider smart grid ecosystem?
So I think that the forecasting work, I think, fits into that broader smart grid ecosystem, because as people are thinking about how they're going to manage the grid with solar and other types of renewables on the grid, they're going to want to have more insight into how all those different production assets are going to behave. So I think the solar forecasting work we're doing clearly fits into that broader smart grid piece. In terms of the rest of the work, it's really more about helping people optimize and understand how all these assets are performing and service them so that they can continue to drive down that cost of solar. So I think it's a little bit sort of outside of what people usually think of as smart grid. Yes?
With driving down the cost of solar, to what extent have you attempted to build partnerships with perhaps manufacturers to help them avoid building sensing equipment into their panels?
So we've as I say, we work with some OEMs to provide embedded monitoring type solutions, but we have not worked with anyone around in terms of eliminating sensors, because usually the sensors are come as add-on components, right? So it's additional equipment that people are installing. So we haven't worked with anyone specifically on that problem yet. And yes?
Could you briefly describe your major revenue source by product, and then where you can see the database that you have, what it can evolve to, and how you can monetize the data in the future?
So I mean, our main revenue source today is in terms of selling this monitoring and analytics service to all of our clients, right? So we do that both on the residential and commercial scale. And we're fairly balanced across those segments, and that's where the bulk of our revenue comes from. And then in terms of where we see future revenue sources, I think that some of the things that I've talked about today and some of the other analytic technologies we're working on are things that we see as value-added technologies that we can use to help our clients, right? And we hope they see some additional value from those sorts of products. Yes?
So do you see yourself primarily as a technology company or as an energy company? And do you think somewhere along the line you might want to leverage all these tools you have to actually become a developer in either commercial or residential?
So we see ourselves as a technology company that's helping enable the growth of these energy industries. And then yes, the types of services that we provide, and in many ways the sort of the ability to monitor how much energy is generated and figure out how your assets are performing is core to the problems that many, say, solar finance or project developers need to solve. So we see ourselves as being able to help folks like that solve those problems in a better way because we're able to leverage sort of our collective knowledge and experience across a pretty broad installed set of systems to solve those problems. Yes?
Recently there was some news on a tariff by the Department of Commerce on solar panels. Just wanted to know how that is going to impact the solar industry, and do you think that's going to reduce the installations and the market? Or you think that the prospects of the solar industry after that happened are still pretty positive?
Great, yep. So the question was, how does the recent tariff on products affect the overall solar industry? And so I would say, there are a lot of different viewpoints on that, and I would say I probably don't have being on the more technology side, I don't particularly have a strong point of view on the impact, right? But from what I've seen, it sounds like people see that as, not something that's going to overall impact the growth of solar in the U.S., right? The rate of cost reduction is pretty great. So some minor added cost back into the system isn't going to derail the overall trend. Okay. Yes?
Sorry to go back to this, but can you talk about what the cost of the service is, either on a per kilowatt hour basis or whatever other basis that it would be charged to a customer?
So we provide this as both, there are two elements to the cost. There's the element of sort of the equipment cost that needs to go in, right? And then there's the ongoing service cost. And so both of those costs are shaped by sort of the specifics of what's the equipment that goes in, and then what are some of the different service offerings that go into those. So without going into sort of specific dollar costs, I can just say that in terms of percentage of system cost, we aim to be very small, right? Less than 1% in terms of installed system cost. So our costs, we're designing, and oftentimes we're much less than that. So we're designing our system to be very low cost and highly scalable.
All right, well, Sally, thanks very much, Shawn.
Okay, thank you. That was great.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.